Hello, my name is Wenqing Wu, an Associate Research Fellow of the Institute of Political Science at Academia Sinica, Taiwan. Today, I'm going to share some of our research findings with you regarding the perils of Chinese foreign aid. This research is a collaborative project with two of my colleagues, Dingyi Lai at National Zhongzheng University and Wenzhen Lin at National Zhenjiang University. In the past 2 decades, China has experienced tremendous economic growth since the 1980s. It also transformed itself from a major aid recipient to a major donor in the world. According to an international team, a data project based in the William and Mary College in the United States, the amount of U.S. foreign aid for the period between 2000 and 2014 is $354 billion, while the amount of U.S. foreign aid is $394 billion. In other words, China has become a major donor of foreign aid in the world. However, there is a significant difference between Chinese aid and other major donors' aid, especially the aid from OECD countries. Specifically, OECD countries' aid is usually concessional and conditional, aiming to facilitate recipient countries' political and economic reform and adjustment. By contrast, China follows the non-interference principle and does not impose conditionalities on recipient countries, so it is usually described as no-string-attached aid. Specifically, Chinese aid is more flexible. Some recent studies report that countries receiving more Chinese aid have better short-term economic growth and lower economic inequality. However, other studies report that Chinese aid has other negative outcomes, including low accountability and corruption. As a result, Chinese aid is sometimes labeled as rogue aid because it is lucrative but toxic to recipient countries. In this study, we investigate the relationship between Chinese foreign aid and recipient countries' political and social outcomes. We argue that the non-conditionalities of Chinese aid cannot induce political leaders in recipient countries to improve policy performance, such as providing education or enhancing public health. Furthermore, it may also erode the existing democratic principle because the politicians have fewer incentives to follow the rule. They may also use the extra resources from China to bend the rule. As a result, we argue that the inflow of Chinese foreign aid results in several perils in recipient countries. It inhibits recipient countries' democratic development, rule of law, freedom of expression, gender political equality. It also increases their level of corruption. Meanwhile, we argue that receiving Chinese aid may not have positive effect on improving recipient countries' public health issues. Furthermore, it will reduce the level of public good provision in recipient countries, such as primary education enrollment rate. We collect data for 117 countries for the period between 2000 and 2017 to test our argument with statistical models. The key supplementary variables is the annual amount of Chinese aid in the recipient country. The dependent variables are political and social outcomes. We also include other political and social variables in our empirical analysis. Our key finding is that Chinese aid has negative impact on a country's democratic development, rule of law, freedom of expression, political gender equality. It also increases the overall corruption in the recipient countries. These findings are summarized in a figure of coefficients on the screen, where positive coefficient indicate positive effect of Chinese aid, and negative coefficient indicate negative impact of Chinese aid. And the length of horizontal bars indicate the level of uncertainty of our estimate in our statistical models. At the same time, we find no evidence to support that Chinese aid improves public health in recipient countries. Instead, it reduces primary school enrollment rate and female employment ratio in the recipient countries. It has to be mentioned that in our statistical models, we also include the amount of ODA aid given by other countries, including those OECD countries. We find that ODA-like aid is usually actually beneficial to recipient countries, while Chinese aid has the opposite effect. In other words, ODA-like aid is helpful for recipient countries, but Chinese aid endangers recipient countries' political and social aspects. We attribute these differences to non-conditionality of Chinese aid. One may wonder whether our findings are a result of reverse causality. For example, countries that have lower democratic development may receive more aid from China. Countries with more corrupt politicians would like to seek aid from China because China's aid is non-conditional. To address this issue of reverse causality, also known as endogeneity issue in econometric terms, we conduct a series of instrumental variable regression models. We follow previous studies and use variables related to the annual steel production of China and recipient countries. Our instrument is related to aid from China, but not related to the political and social outcomes we analyzed in this study. So we can get rid of this issue of reverse causality in our empirical analysis. After using instrumental variable regression models, our findings hold for democratic development, rule of law, freedom of expression, political gender equality, regime corruption, and female employment. But the effect of Chinese aid on primary education enrollment rate disappears. To summarize our findings, the nature of non-conditionality of Chinese aid empowers political leaders to escape restrictions on their power, making it difficult to uphold democracy and accountability. In short, Chinese aid is not a free lunch for recipient countries. Our findings have two important policy implications. First, we should pay more attention to the level of transparency and conditionality of Chinese aid. Secondly, the international donor community needs to ask China to follow ODA standards in its aid commitment. These are our findings on the perils of Chinese foreign aid in recipient countries. Thank you very much.